Good evening. This is Redwood Wonk on Access Humboldt. You're either listening to us on the radio KZZH or watching us on Access Humboldt Channel 12. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm with Chuck Rogers. We're here to talk the crazy national politics of the day, and we have a lot to talk about. I figure, why don't we start out with CPAC? What does that even stand for, Chuck?
Conservative Political Action Conference.
Yes.
And this, it's usually held in the area right around Washington, D.C., but this year they moved it to Orlando.
Right. And so we have it. It usually, okay, it used to be actually something that a lot of conservatives could get behind, and it used to, you have libertarians, moderates, and the rest, but it's pretty much in recent years been taken over by a certain faction. I mean, it's always fascinating to watch it. It's of all the political conferences, it gets the most media attention. There's no equivalent on the left, by the way. I mean, there's some, but this is like the who's who. This is like the Academy Awards or something of right-wing politics, and and who gets invited and who doesn't. It always tells a story. Pence didn't get invited. I think he was smarting from that, and we'll talk about him. McConnell didn't get invited. Certainly, Liz Cheney didn't get invited, nor Ben Sasse, and basically, it's kind of showing that for the moment, the conservative movement and possibly the Republican Party belongs to Donald Trump, and it was shown in a really odd way that generated a lot of kind of references to the Bible and to the scene, the debauchery scene in the Ten Commandments. So what happened there, Chuck?
Well, it's interesting you put it that way. I had the same reaction to it too. It's clear from CPAC that Donald Trump is the Republican Party at this point. In fact, Trump is he's the Pope of Trumpism. It was an adoring crowd that just lavished affection on him. And, this is a guy who is a one-term president, lost the popular vote twice, was impeached twice, lost the Senate and the House, and they're hitching their wagon to him again. They even rolled in a golden statue of him and installed it there at the meeting. And, at this point, he's infallible, and the statue is the cross of their calling. And I guess the next step is that Mar-a-Lago becomes Vatican City.
It is interesting, and there's all kinds of ironies in it. It was made in Mexico. And the
statue?
The statue was made in Mexico, and it looked to me, and a lot of jokes about it. It looked less like Trump and more like the Big Bob Boy Burgers or whatever, Big Boy Bob Burger statue painted gold. But the irony of it being painted gold, when you've got this biblical reference to after Moses goes up to collect the Ten Commandments from God, comes back down and everybody is acting sinful and evil and whatnot, making sacrifices to a golden calf they made. I've always wondered where they found the gold in the middle of the desert, but anyway, they have a golden calf, and and Moses rebukes them and gets rid of the calf and the rest, but it's just that thou shalt not worship graven idols was like I think the second second commandment, and so that it was there. They literally made it. And here, I mean, you would think that a lot of these people with religious backgrounds would kind of get that irony there, and yet that was the whole story of CPAC. They brought it in, and it's almost like they're worshiping Trump or an idol of him. And every speech was geared towards, the stolen election, the big lie, as it's being called now.
Right.
Very little towards policy, actually.
Well, that was my takeaway from it. It's no longer a political organization that wants to talk about ideas and debate the ideas and work out plans to face a complicated future and decide what the best pathway is and which are the best plans, and let's figure this out together. That's not who they are anymore. It's about Donald Trump. It is about the worship of this one person. And, interestingly enough, if you recall, back in 2015, 16, and 17, and so on, there were a few, not all, of course, but there were a few who, when questioned about the character of the person they were following, that some of them, a few, said, he was sent here by God. We know he's not perfect, but we are the ones who are following him, and he is going to deliver this nation. So, it's... I can't explain it, and I don't know of anybody who really can. I mean, if you read a lot of political analysis and listen to a lot of it, there's nobody who's explaining this in political terms anymore, because it is not explainable with standard political analysis. It's just a cult of one person.
It really is. And I'm watching interviews with the people who have been gathering for the big day tomorrow, when some people believe he's supposed to return to power as the 19th president.
Right.
And I've explained the theory on the past shows. It's really not even that interesting enough to repeat, but they really do believe that tomorrow will be the real inauguration, that he's going to have a lot of people arrested, hold military tribunals, there may even be executions, and the like. I mean, all the same rhetoric again, which of course has people up on edge, and we'll talk about that a little bit as to what's going to happen tomorrow. The House has canceled its votes tomorrow because they're worried about a repeat or even something worse. But anyway, CPAC used to have people like George Shultz, Gene Kirkpatrick, Irving Kristol. I mean, this was where ideas were to be debated and well, not debated, but presented in terms of the conservative movement when Buckley tried to develop the intelligentsia of it, and that's how it kind of got started. And it was about policy, and they talked about the balanced budget amendment and and things like that, and there was no policy. I mean, I listened to a few of the speeches, and I figured because I was doing the show, I would start listening to Trump, but he just did the same old thing. And I think about 5-10 minutes in, I said, I think I can go off the highlights, and the highlights were just the same speech he's been making for the past year.
Right, and also listing by name the people who had voted against him during the impeachment, the whole impeachment, the second impeachment. I guess we need to distinguish which impeachment. But yeah, he listed them by name and said we need to make them all go away. And so each of those individuals he listed, and we know who they are going to get primary opponents that are going to have Donald Trump's endorsement, and it will follow from that the folks who are now the CPAC attendees will be doing all they can to get people like Liz Cheney and so on thrown out of office. And recall, it hasn't been that long ago when Paul Ryan was Speaker of the House following John Boehner. It was Paul Ryan who said we need to get back to debating ideas and figure out how to move this country forward. It's about debating ideas. That wasn't that long ago. And that was Paul Ryan. I don't agree with much of anything that he has to say or has done, but at least he was talking about wanting to discuss ideas regarding public policy. You heard none of that. None. In fact, all of the breakout sessions had to do with the alleged voter fraud. That's all they talked
That's
about.
all they talked about, right?
They didn't talk about education policy or health care or Social Security or any of that. They didn't talk about infrastructure or climate change. They just talked about Donald Trump's lie and his need to continue it because he cannot accept defeat.
There was also a really, interesting moment early on in the conference when these organizers actually got booed. They went up onto the
Right.
stage and they said, we're on private property. The hotel, which obviously wants to protect its employees, has instructed us to put on the mask, and they got booed. They're like, well, we don't have to do that. And so you had one conservative value of private property rights, right?
Right.
You're the
Right.
king of the property you own,
Yep.
and yet even that fell. There were people, and they just weren't wearing masks. You had Cruz go up there and kind of, all the comedians are having fun where he yelled freedom, and he just ranted against masks the whole time.
Yeah.
So that is their big their big rallying cry. It's I don't want to wear a mask, and the election was stolen, and we have a bogus president installed by the deep state.
Yeah, and also Trump mentioned, he did bring up the issue of, him starting a new party. There's been a lot talked about and written about, Trump will start his own party. And he addressed that and said he's not going to do that. Yeah. And he said, why do I need to do that? I have the Republican Party. Yeah. So he's clearly thinking that his vehicle going forward is what we think of as the Republican Party, which puts the ball in the court now of the never Trumpers, of people like Ben Sasse and others who are Liz Cheney and others who are thinking about wanting to return to a conservative party that is about ideas, at least. What are they going to do now? Because clearly after CPAC, there is an absolute 100% direction that has been decided upon. So do people like Ben Sasse and Liz Cheney just, hold their nose and move forward with that? Or do they start their own conservative party? I think they should. I know that means they'll take a hit electorally in the short term. But as I've said before, looking long range, I think that's the only way to salvage a conservative party that has something to do with ideas. What do you think about that?
Well, as we saw, Liz Cheney got into more renewed her problems by doubling down. We've talked about that in the speech, and she's not backing off of that. She's pretty much running with the Republicans on almost every other issue. I think she's decided she can't afford to go independent on anything else other than opposing Trump. But there is definitely a never Trump crowd. But how many of the Republican voters are never Trump? And how many of them believe that the election was stolen? They have to. I mean, really, we need. I know there have been some polls about that, and they're all over the place in terms of numbers. But again, and we've talked about this in the last couple of shows, it's very dangerous when tens of millions of people believe that the government is illegitimate. Yeah. And they'll say, well, the Democrats did that in 2016. It was like, no, we didn't. We knew that the election was there. What we said was that there was intervention in the election, but the election, people went into the ballots and they voted. And they made that bad decision, according to some of us, but we never challenged the legitimacy of the election itself.
Yeah, you know what else is dangerous? Minority rule. We've seen that all over the world. It's called apartheid. Minority rule is dangerous too. And here's a guy. What is it? 7 of the last 8 elections, the Republicans have lost the popular vote. Yet we have had Republican presidents during that span of time. So, they look at the same statistics we look at. They know that within the next 20 to 30 years or so, they're going to be a distinct minority in this country, and it's heading that direction without doubt. It's very clear. Right. So they have decided that their pathway forward is not about ideas. It's about voter suppression. It's about taking advantage of structural problems in our political system that will allow them to remain viable as long as those structural problems are not addressed, like with something like H.R. 1 or with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and so on, that need to pass and that need to be put into place. But they're going to oppose all that because they think they can keep going as a minority party.
No, and Graham has said that we need to stop mail-in voting or we'll never be elected again. He said that outright. I mean, just like unapologetically. And in the Supreme Court the other day, which it looks like there is going to be some bad parts of that decision, but it doesn't look like they're going to totally gut the Voting Rights Act by because they were arguing, well, you can't regulate the voting time, place, and manner. And then, and actually a couple of the conservative justices came out and caught them in some really big contradictions. And they kind of had to backtrack, well, does that mean that you can hold a precinct election at a country club somewhere that, and they said, well, no, that wouldn't be allowed. Well, that's time, place, and manner, right? So it looks like they're not going to be totally able to defang it, but it does look like they're going to allow some suppression measures that have reached the Supreme Court to go through. And of course, what are the big suppression efforts? We now have, as of this morning, an article I read, now across the country, 253 voter suppression bills. This is the Republicans' response to losing the election, they need to suppress the vote. In Georgia, they're going to shorten the time for early voting. They're going to eliminate voting on Sundays because of the black church, big movements where they would actually go vote. And that's aimed right at them. I mean, that's something that wouldn't have survived the Voting Rights Act before. Because that's aimed right at suppressing the black vote, because they're the ones who vote on Sundays in large numbers because of that. So we've got that. We've got voter ID laws that they're pushing. They're really making it hard to vote by mail, and just every way they can do to have fewer voters, because that's the only way they can preserve their incumbents and maintain it. The only way they can win again in Georgia, apparently.
Well, exactly. And, all of that has to do with how the Supreme Court is going to look at this, not only now, but in the future, which once again reminds us that elections have consequences, don't they? Because how does a justice get to the Supreme Court? Nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate. Whoever controls those levers gets to pick who's on the Supreme Court and move them through. So elections have consequences. And here we are, the Voting Rights Act, of all things. One person, one vote is what this country is supposed to be like, right?
Yeah, no, and they are now basically bringing back Jim Crow in a little bit more subtle manner, but it is aimed at, they've already gerrymandered to basically contain the black vote in Alabama most drastically, but everywhere else too in the South. And this is aimed at the black vote, aimed at younger voters. And all of the constituents. It's bare, naked power play on this, and fewer people voting is their goal, and they're not even hiding that fact. They even said that outright in the Supreme Court arguments.
Yeah, so, the attorney said basically that in response to a question by Justice Barrett. He said, well, this would harm Republicans. Politics is a zero-sum game, I think is exactly what he said.
Yeah, well, it's at any rate, it'll be interesting to see what happens in Georgia, because I don't know if the bills have passed yet, but there is some rumors that the governor will actually veto them.
But you know what, Eric, the only thing that gives me a little bit of hope in all of this is that the harder the Republicans press on voter suppression, the more obvious it's going to be, which means the more energy there's going to be on the left. I mean, look what happened in Georgia after Stacey Abrams lost the gubernatorial race when the Secretary of State, who was also running for governor, just purged 300,000 people off of the voter rolls. They got angry about that and they got organized. So I think the more the Republicans push this, the more it's going to energize the Democrats in every one of those states. And when this happened recently, 2 Democrats won the Senate seats in Georgia. So,
Yeah.
I think bring it on. Bring it on. I think it's going to energize the left.
That's true. Yeah, maybe they won't need the Sunday votes. They'll get the people out, anyway. And that's what organization is going to have to retake. That's what the South was always afraid of before.
Right.
These big, lines of people coming and voting. They hate that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's anyway that that there is I think you said in almost half the states. These 253 bills are, so probably that's like about 10 bills in each state, it sounds like.
Yeah.
And just on a massive way, and it's all aimed at fewer voters. It's just the cynicism behind that. And we're going to talk a little bit about some other cynicism, but that is just incredibly cynical. Not like, well, gee, maybe we should try to win over some of those voters. Black voters are actually socially conservative. Maybe we can win them over on some of these other issues if we, maybe ease up on these other issues. Maybe take a slightly more progressive, maybe Eisenhower type progressive economic view and with regard to taxes. They don't want to do that. They are so, pure in their ideology that they don't want to have to be trying to sell and compromise it to sell to non-white voters. And I mean, there are a lot of Latinos who are socially conservative, very deeply religious, opposed to abortion, but they vote Democratic because of racism and other issues. There are Chinese and Asians who are socially conservative. Every group they could go to. And Trump, as we've talked about, did pick up votes in all of those groups. So why aren't they figuring maybe we can get more? They're not.
I don't know. They're, instead of doing an autopsy on their recent losses there and figuring out ideas that they could present to attract new voters, they're wanting to just change the rules of the game. Yeah. Instead of getting a better playbook, they want to change the rules of the game. But which brings up a question, and we've talked about this person before, John Roberts. Mm-hmm. As you and I have mentioned before, he is, among the 9 justices, certainly one of the justices who is very concerned about the integrity of the court, the dignity of the court, the future of the court, its legacy. So what is he going to do as these cases, no doubt, will, some of them, not all, but some of them end up before the Supreme Court? What's he going to do?
We'll find out in June what he does with this one. I mean, it's so at any rate, I mean, right now, the reason Republicans have as much power as they do is because the structure is, set up. I mean, the Senate structure is absolutely backwards, and the Senate should either be dissolved or should be made more regional, where there's proportionate representation of it. Because a senator in Wyoming, a voter in Wyoming has like hundreds times more power than a Senate voter in California. And I want to talk a little bit about that because, for instance, the Republicans are uniformly opposing the COVID bill, even though it's popular. Even though it's 70% popular, if you take the $1,400 payments, it's 80%. I mean, incredible. So why do they not have to do this? Well, for one thing, we're in a time where you vote identity more than policy. Still, we're still we've got that issue. People don't change their votes based on, well, I want that policy. They don't see politics that way. I'm not saying that for everybody, but for a lot of people, it's based on who they are and their identity as they're voting. But there's another problem, too, is that you've got, 25 senators or something who represent something like 12% of the population, right? I mean, I believe that if you take all of the the votes, it's like 185 million represented by Democrats, like 130 million represented by Republicans, and that's including states like Pennsylvania, which are one of the states we're going to talk about in a minute. But the structure of the Senate favors it even more than the Electoral College. The structure of the Senate favors white rural conservatives. That's just the way it is.
Yeah.
And there's no getting around it. It was set up as an elitist way of controlling populism, and basically to keep slavery in place for as long as it could. I'm sorry, but that was part of the motivation of it. And it has a bit more power in some ways than the House, and yet it is incredibly undemocratic. And now, with the polarization, I'm going to, with the map that should appear on everybody's screen, we are at one of the lowest points in decades. I'm not even sure when the last time we had only 6 states which are have both a Republican and a Democratic senator. And we've got 3 of them, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Wisconsin, that are in the Midwest. Pennsylvania, and Ohio is a bit of a fluke because you've got a very progressive Sherrod Brown who manages to win elections there. They've spent all kinds of money trying to defeat him. In fact, in 2012, the only candidate who received more dark money spent against him was Obama. They really thought that they could take Sherrod Brown out of that. He's won that. He won us again in 2018, and not even that close. So he somehow manages to get elected in Ohio. We need to talk about that. Manchin has a little bit of a different model for being elected in West Virginia, very conservative state. It used to be Democratic because of the Union, but that with the coal industry falling apart and being on the defensive, West Virginia has become very conservative. And then we talk, and his way of doing it is to be moderate. And whereas you contrast with Montana, which John Tester miraculously managed to get reelected there, and doing so by remaining somewhat progressive. And then the other 2 states, the other state is Maine. I think I've got all 6 of them there, and that's Collins, because a lot of voters there, including Democrats, have bought into the notion that she's independent, and she definitely was independent with this impeachment vote, but she hasn't shown much evidence of that elsewhere, but somehow she's managed to sell that to Maine voters. Those are the 6. I mean, it used to be we had states all across with mixed senators, and they would actually caucus with each other and talk compromises and things like that. That doesn't happen anymore.
Why is that? Is it all about identity politics? Is it? I guess the question I struggle with when you run through that list of states there, and it is curious, is democracy weakening, or is authoritarianism becoming stronger, or is it some of both? And does it differ from one party to the other? Do the 2 parties have totally different views now about what democracy is and what the best way forward is?
I mean, that's at least part of the explanation. There is definitely a tendency within the Republican Party right now, within the conservative movements, that maybe democracy isn't that grand a thing. I mean, there are people, you talk to some of the Trump supporters, they would be happy with a military dictatorship. That is a real dangerous thing in this experiment. And you'll hear people say, I mean, conservatives always like to say this is not a democracy, it's a republic. Well, it's actually both. It's a republic with democratic institutions. A republic doesn't have to be democratic, by the way. Right. So it just has to be. It's how you're represented as opposed to how you choose your leaders. But democracy is not necessarily a value. I mean, it's not even they would bring in real democracy. There are actual large numbers of conservatives who are thinking that maybe democracy is not what we need in this country. And that's very dangerous.
Well, how do they sell themselves as a patriot then? I mean, if you're going to be a patriot, you I suppose, would champion the United States Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, right?
You wanted to amend it. We have a process for amendment. We can amend it to get rid of, to make it less democratic. We can have some choices, but there should be an override by the electors. And when there's a bad president, those electors should exercise that override. That's in the Constitution. They can do that. There's, under except for the state laws. But that's honestly, like I said, there are people who are saying that democracy is, it could lead to things that go against God, by unified marriage, LGBTQ rights, abortion rights. All of those things are against God, and democracy is secondary to being able to end those things.
What about the separation of church and state?
Yeah, well, they don't. They will tell there. You will have conservatives tell you that there's no such thing. They'll say that was just something that when Jefferson talked about a wall of separation, he wasn't talking about a separation of church and state. This is God's country, and Jefferson they have a whole argument about that. There are schools of conservative thought that say there should be no separation between church and state. Right now, the question is, okay, which church, right? But that's
so they would disagree. They would disagree that religion should be in churches and synagogues and mosques and so on, or whatever it might be, and public policy should be in the houses of the state legislature and in Congress. And there should be a separation there. Religion in church, public policy in Congress. They would disagree with that.
They would disagree with that. And this goes back to the ideology of the moral majority in the 1980s with the Reagan takeover. They would disagree with that. There are certain things that should be up for discussion, but we are God's nation, and therefore, we should not have a system that allows laws which defy God to be in power, and you need somebody to decide that, and that means you need leaders who are paying close attention to the church and the Bible. And this is outright. I met people in college who believe that. Yeah. But I just kind of saw them as, different, kind of out in the ozone and on their own. But it's much more popular than it's just that basically. We have a few people like that on the left, like when I was arguing about about 20 years ago as the Eastern Bloc was coming down and Poland was writing into new laws, and people would say, how can you call that democracy when they just voted out their socialized medicine? It's like, well, democracy is the right to make a bad decision. It is the collective right to make a bad decision. Right. And that just doesn't, a lot of people, their views of democracy are result-oriented, based on result rather than process-oriented, and accepting a loss is just not something in there. They expected Trump to be reelected. Trump has, and they believe he was reelected, and hands down. But because we have a system that allows something else to happen, we need to change that system. And I think they would be fine with doing an elections, at least for the time being, until we can get this country back in order.
Well, and following on that, there are folks who would define politics as a system by which we solve our disputes, our disagreements, right? And that if there's no disagreement on something, it's not political. But when it comes to those who think religion should be a part of politics, how do we solve that problem when you have one cohort that is basing everything that it sees for the future on faith, and others who are trying to keep faith in the churches and the synagogues and wanting to deal with public policy in another arena? How do you bridge that gap?
I don't know. I just don't know. We've got to deal with this. Other countries have dealt with this. What's that?
What have they done?
Well, I mean, you just processed it out. But there have been military coups based. I mean, part of the justification for Franco overthrowing the republic was it was stepping on Catholic Church's toes. The Republicans were, So it takes time. You got to work it out. That was a war. That's not what we want to see happen. But there are some people who believe that democracy is nice, but God's will is prevalent, and we know what God's will is, and we got to make sure that happens.
Well, you spend more time on some of the sites where these things are discussed than I do. Is it your view, from having spent time in those venues, that they are intransigent? That is, that's their position, and it's not going to change, and as a result, they would be just fine being their own country and telling the rest of us, you're not welcome?
I think there are some who are that way. Now, I meet a lot of different kinds of conservatives on there. I meet people who are actually secular conservatives. That's a very interesting group themselves. Right. And I meet libertarians, and I meet people who are process oriented, who really, who study the Constitution, know it well. People in the Federalist Society, mm-hmm. I have discussions with all the time in the legal chat rooms. But there is an element, and it is the largest I've seen, and are indicated in history, at least for a very long time, of people who are, it's result oriented, and the country is God's country, and God is, God wants Trump in power, as a corollary right now, and that's the way it is. I mean, we are at that stage right now. And there are a lot of people I talk to on the left who say, oh, it's not any different. He's no different from Reagan or Bush. Democrats and Republicans are the same. You'll see a lot of them say, and by saying this, you're making a big deal. You're feeding into them and the rest. But I don't think they grasp, I think people on the left need to read Hannah Arendt to understand, others too, but Hannah Arendt really understood the process by which you can move towards totalitarianism. I mean, it's a very deliberate process. It's a whole frame of mind, and I'm seeing a lot of those signs right now. I don't think it's going to happen. This election could have been the 1933 German election, for instance. It was not, and I think there's a lot of pushback. I think there are a lot of people who are principled conservatives who don't want any part of that. That's why we're seeing the Lincoln Project, Steve Smith, and all those people. I hope they can keep it together, But so, anyways, I mean, but there, and it's not a majority. It's probably 40% of the voters, 30% of the population, but it's large. And it's
in our current structure. That's all they need.
Right.
They don't need 50%.
Yeah.
That's part of what you were just talking about with the Senate maps. They don't need 50%. They can get by with 35 to 45 and figure out ways to navigate our system with that minority. So is this only solvable generationally? That is, with the passage of time and a new generation? I mean, it's not like that there aren't young folks in the Trump universe. If you looked at the folks who attended CPAC, yeah, most of them were older, but there was a fair number of young folks. So it's not as if the next generation and the one after it are 100% opposed to authoritarianism. But it seems like the next couple of generations do see this for what it is, and would want to get back to something that resembles us following the Constitution, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, totalitarianism is a product of mass economic trauma. I don't want to be an economic determinist or anything like that. I don't want to sound that way, but we have had some really bad economic times. Mm-hmm. We've had a declining of a manufacturing industry where people, where people who graduated high school could go to work in a factory, and if they were saved and were careful, they could buy a house by the time they were in their 30s or at least 40s, right. Save up and have a decent retirement, and and there still is some of that, but there's much less of it due to outsourcing because of the trade agreements, due to the manufacturing becoming more automated, and so and the Democrats here, they have to have an economic recovery, but not the one that's just monetarily that improves the stock market and gives people more jobs, so that they can pay their rent. They've got to really think about structuring the economy so that ultimately, and this is the key, that we have an economy that gives somebody who is male and with only a high school education an opportunity to make a living. That is the key here. Yeah. Is that those people are feeling demasculated. They're watching the towns that used to be thriving kind of falling apart. Even here in Eureka, you see that sign. You go back and you look at all of the activity and neighborhoods full of kids and lots of cultural activities happening. And the rest of the 1950s, you see the old newspaper articles and stuff. And now it's kind of like, we're like a shadow of what it once was. We've got to come up with an economic model that revives that. And again, it's only about a little over a month into his presidency, but he cannot pull us through by being technocratic and passive. And on a few questions, Democrats are getting kind of technocratic and passive. They let Joe Manchin, talk them into lowering the threshold for the coronavirus direct payments, and that's a middle class who are probably doing okay and probably don't need it, but you're burning them, right? That is. I don't understand the political calculus there. I don't understand Manchin opposing, minimum wage hikes when people in his state would probably benefit more than other. And his own governor is saying we need to be bold, and he's like, it's almost like he just is there to show, hey, I got a compromise here that shows how effective I am politically. I don't think he thought it through, but now. People who are earning anywhere over 75,000 individually or 150,000 in a couple are, those people aren't that rich. In some parts of the country, that's barely enough to pay rent, and people are moving out of San Francisco, because they don't have to be there anymore. Tech people they're going to be closing down offices because one thing this coronavirus has done is it's fulfilled the prophecy of 20 years ago of people telecommuting. So if they're telecommuting, they can live anywhere. They can come up to Eureka and buy a house, right, and still be working in San Francisco. So it's and they don't have to. Then the companies don't have to pay for the offices. Great. So what are the people, the leaders, thinking in terms of, okay, maybe we could take an opportunity here to bring in some working class jobs into San Francisco. I mean, we need to think about these things, and so that there isn't a perceived decline. We need to restructure our thinking so we don't consider ourselves an empire, and because an empire is only going to decline. We need to think in terms of what is sustainable, and all of that's the only way you can do it. There will be some people who are always going to believe what they're going to believe, but there'll be fewer of them.
The Republicans used to look backwards and say, oh, the good old days, by which they meant the 1950s, when this country was expanding and, there was, what some people would call full employment. And people were, as you just said, making enough money at blue collar jobs that, they could buy a house, they could buy a car, they could save a little money, they could take a 2-week vacation, and guess what? They could also send their kids to school. And that was the dream of the middle class. Well, that's gone. And Republicans are now the ones who oppose raising the minimum wage, which would help restore some of that. But $15, I think, is that's a start. That's not, that doesn't get us back to that level. So, it's hard for me to see how this is sustainable with if you follow the lines of the Republican Party and what they're proposing, what little they're proposing other than just worship of Donald Trump. So I agree with you. I think restoring the middle class and reducing the income gap is what we have to do. Whether we can do that in our current political structure, I don't know. I'm not even sure I'm optimistic given our current political structure, that we can do that. But clearly, that's what needs to be done. The income gap is a big part of our problem right now.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and that, so, that we need to really think in terms of that. I mean, the left has to really be aggressive. Bernie Sanders actually is really pushing, is going to put up a fight and force a vote on the minimum wage, which really should be increased again. That's the two quote unquote moderates in the Senate are basically throwing their weight around, and it's at the expense of the working class, and it's at the expense of a lot of people. We need to talk about at least revising the filibuster, if not eliminating it altogether. Right. And unless they can start going bold and they keep letting their proposals get watered down the way the coronavirus bill is being watered down, I just I don't see a lot of hope for it, because then the left and people who vote for progressive constituencies will just get discouraged again and not vote, and then Trump wins again. So they really need to think about this. Biden, I thought, made a big mistake coming out and saying maybe we aren't going to be able to get the wage increase. What is he doing saying that? Don't say it until it happens. I mean, that was the type of thing Obama did, and I think I think he was trying to lower expectations. Forget the expectations. Show us you're willing to fight, even if you lose, and it's just, anyway, I am a little nervous about that, but I am, there is pent up demand. The economy is probably going to pull back in the spring as we start to open up, as more of us get vaccinated. This thing that Biden brokered between the two companies to produce a lot more of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a big deal. Yeah. I think the more people that do it, maybe then some of the 30% who say they don't want to take vaccines will change their minds, at least enough of them to get herd immunity. If they can do that, but it's not going to be enough for the long run. Then they got to start talking about, how they're going to restructure the economy and the infrastructure around the sustainable technologies. The fight in Texas is like a key battle point there. We need, we've got old forces entrenched, the oil industry entrenched in trying to stop those changes. But Green New Deal is, earning a bad name politically, is something that could actually be job positive and economics positive. And we really need they really do need to go bold, because that's the only thing that will overcome this really dark ideology.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you saw this, but it's interesting you mentioned infrastructure. It was either yesterday or the day before. The American Society of Civil Engineers released their most recent grade for us, and we're a C-. Now, that's up from a D, only because there are a few things that have been done. But a C- is still, I forgot the exact category, but it still means that major work needs to be done before things start falling down, basically. And they used more professional language than that, of course. But that's where we are. In a country like this, our infrastructure is a C-. And you know what? That has implications with regard to international trade, with regard to retaining smart people here who may have offers overseas that might be better at this point. This is something that, it's not the most fun thing to talk about, and it takes a long time, and it's a long range kind of thing. There aren't immediate results with it because it takes a long time to deal with infrastructure, but it's absolutely essential.
No, I agree. And that we really have to think in those terms, because we've been declining since the 1990s. We got a little bit of a reprieve with the tech industry expanding. And this will be kind of interesting, because if people are moving out into rural areas, and tech people are even moving into red states, along with Latino migrations into red states, votes can change.
Yeah, right.
So it's just it may be that old dichotomy, urban progressive versus red. So that I hold some hope there. And then if we ever get to a point where we can have, sort of a constitutional convention on we need to revisit a few things, including the structure of the Senate, which is about one of the most undemocratic institutions in any democratic republic there is, because that's what's holding us back.
Yeah, well, that migration out of the urban areas by tech folks is what some people point to with regard to the state of Texas. That is at least why we think of it now as being at least in play. And they also point to that with regard to the recent elections in Georgia and what's happening around the Atlanta metro area. So you may be right about that. This may fix itself because of migration. We'll see.
We are at the point of the show where we provide our, wisdom in our predictions. We'll see what comes true. Chuck, what have you got?
Two quick things. One, I think in West Virginia and in Arizona, you're going to see progressives at least move to try to challenge Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema in those two states. I don't know how successful they'll be, but I think it's going to get kind of nasty and rough and tumble in those states politically. We'll see how that goes. The second thing, I think we're going to start hearing very soon about universal guaranteed income, which is what Andrew Yang had been talking about in the last presidential election. The reason is somewhat local. It's here in California. City of Stockton 2 years ago started an experiment with, a couple of hundred people, giving them $500 a month to just help support them. No strings attached. The result has been incredible, and you can look up the city of Stockton's experiment on this and read about it. It had tremendous results. Most of those people, by the way, ended up getting full employment because that money gave them time to either get child care so they could go to interviews or afford transportation to go to interviews, put food on the table so they felt better. So it's had tremendous results. So I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about that thanks to the experiment in Stockton.
All right. My first prediction is that Becerra and Deb Haaland, who will be the first Native American woman to hold, I think, any cabinet office, but also the Secretary of the Interior. Not one Republican asked her any question about her vision for Native America, or Indian America, as they call it. Not one. Everything was geared towards trying to paint her as a radical leftist. Anyways, I believe both of them will be appointed on strict party votes. Right. It'll be 50-50 with a tie break from Harris. And then my second prediction is that the economy is going to start reopening, and as that happens, you're going to hear more and more from the right about how as they scramble to account for the fact that there's going to be an expansion of the economy, that we should thank Trump for it. And that's going to be a big debate over the next a year and a half and going into the 22 elections, is whether or not this is the Trump or Biden economy. You can argue it's still the Obama economy, but at any rate, we're going to see a lot more of that.
I agree.
All right. Well, with that, I want to thank Access Humboldt again. This has been Redwood Wonk. You can hear us on the radio on Tuesday and Thursday nights at 7 o'clock, and you can see us on Channel 12 on Wednesday and Saturday nights at 8:30. Sometimes you can hear us elsewhere, and you can always go to YouTube and hear us. Look at Access Humboldt, and you can watch us on YouTube. And if anybody wants us to address anything, we now have an email address, redwoodwonk@gmail.com. If there's something you want to address, if there's something you want to tell us, we'll even read your questions on the air as long as they make FCC guidelines. And until next time, have a good evening.